when we are truly dealing with a manipulation strategy is that we tend to get gaslit into believing that what we're saying happened didn't happen. And all of a sudden, you go from being on cloud nine in euphoria to almost being insignificant to this person.
There are 7 stages that someone can use in a relationship to be manipulative and keep you in that toxic cycle. So today I want to go through all 7, break them down on why they do it, and then how we can actually protect ourselves from that behavior.
Yes,
All right,
let's do it.
so let's start. So talk to me about the love bombing stage.
Well, love bombing is whenever we are being fed with a lot of love gestures and a lot of ways in which we tend to like to be loved, and that's happening to the umpteenth degree. So we get hooked to the person, right? Like we feel this euphoria. We feel like, oh, this is the deepest connection I've ever had. This is it. This feels great. And so whenever that happens, the connection is crystallized and it makes it so that we're hooked to a person that could potentially, be pretty damaging to our lives.
I love the breakdown, but let's go a little deeper because as you were explaining it, I was thinking, but what if someone's really just excited? Like, what if you go on that first date and the guy is really interested in you and so he wants to text you? How do you know when it's like the manipulation tactic or it's just the beautiful chemistry between two people?
Well, time will tell whether or not the manipulative tactic to get you hooked into a cycle or if they're actually really interested in you and wanting to get to know you and invested in what you actually like and invested in loving you in the ways that you desire or the ways that work well for you. So, it's sometimes when we offer ourselves a little bit of time to also just get to know a person and allow them to go through the ups and downs with us, we get to see whether or not they're leading in the direction of a toxic cycle or they're simply studying us for the sake of being a good partner to us or being a good friend to us or being a good family member, right? Like all the things. Relationships are, variable, and we can even see a lot of these manipulation strategies in all kinds of relationships, even business relationships. So it's really important for us to give space to time and the most important, to know the signs, right? So when we know the signs, we can actually see them coming. And so we can see that the love bombing stage is truly a love bombing stage and not a I'm getting to know you and I feel deeply connected to you stage.
Oh, I love that. So you mentioned a couple of the signs. So what do you do if you start to see them? Because here's the thing, right? Cloud nine, it feels good.
It does.
Everyone wants to be on cloud nine.
I know.
So when you're on cloud nine, it's very hard to kind of pass this apart of like, what is the genuine thing, right? And really embracing and enjoying that cloud nine feeling instead of being so skeptical, because I would think I would be skeptical if I've already been love bombed in the past. Let's say I've come from a toxic relationship and now I'm in this new one. Do you advise to then just play it out and see how it goes? Like, how do you make sure that maybe you don't invest immediately into them? Because I think sometimes that may also be the person's response when it's like, oh, this feels so good, so this is going to be the person that I marry.
Well, you know what? People that tend to be or have toxic traits tend to be fairly predictable. So
Go on.
yes, so you're going to see the signs show up eventually. And the interesting thing about manipulation strategies is that they follow a path. So if you know what to look out for, you're not going to have to be a skeptic, right? You can enjoy the moment and just in the back of your mind, just understand that if you see a bit of a sign of the next stage, then the skepticism will be healthy skepticism. And what you believe could happen can be corroborated. And it might not be, right? But it's important to have some level of skepticism with every situation that we encounter, right? And every person that we encounter, for us to understand, well, this person, like as human as they are, they can hurt me, or they can be, a good person to me. And so that is, where healthy skepticism lies. It's like right there in that space where there's always a chance and a possibility. And if we can hold that possibility while not drowning in it, just simply allowing ourselves to understand that it's something that can happen, but we can still enjoy the moment and enjoy the person in front of us. And we can really just, focus and be mindfully present with that person. But The second stage, or at least it's more of the third stage, because the second stage is really when you, in essence, get hooked. But the third stage of any manipulation strategy is when a person starts to feel some sense of feeling devalued by the individual. And I think this helps to illustrate with an example. Like, for example, if somebody is, just in that dating stage and they're feeling like everything is going according to plan, and they feel like there is some sort of connection that feels like it's predictable. Like, I know that I'm going to get that good morning, beautiful text, right? And so that's going to happen. But then all of a sudden, the person isn't present and isn't texting back for 3 days, right? And so all of a sudden there's a gap in communication. It's abrupt. And when you connect with them, they're almost kind of saying, like, I really didn't have time for you today. And I didn't have time for you in these last few days. And all of a sudden you go from being on cloud nine in euphoria to almost being insignificant to this person. And there is an element of devaluing your worth in their life in a very abrupt way. And so you start to question, you wonder, like, well, what happened? Like, what did I do? Right. So there's a lot of like that confusion that starts to surface. And that's when we start to see that there is an element of a pattern that's happening. And so that healthy skepticism now turns into a corroboration of what you thought could have happened. Right. But I think that when it comes to, us not drowning ourselves in the possibilities of like something negative, like we can always just stay present and mindful, but also, look out for the possibilities of those signs coming up. And when they do come up, name them. Because when they come up, what tends to happen to us is that we typically say, well, what happened? What could I do different? How can we, like, connect better? Let me set this boundary. And so, let this person know that communication needs to look this way to me, instead of, taking it as a data point, instead of like almost kind of, treating it as perhaps like a bit of a research process where you're collecting information and collecting the different ways in which this person shows up in your life, and identifying what the different ways are that this person is showing up, and whether or not it fits into these stages of manipulation.
Oh, girl, there was so much there that we
I
got to go
know.
down. Okay, so okay, so they do the love bombing, they get you hooked.
Yeah.
That's the second stage, and then the third stage is devaluation. But what does the hooking look like?
It's a lot of what it tends to look like us feeling like really deeply connected with someone in a way where we feel in essence like very happy and euphoric, and like this person can do no wrong. It's really a lot of those like joyous feelings that we tend to feel whenever we feel truly connected to someone. But the thing about the hooking is that it doesn't allow us to see a lot of what's to come. So it's important for us to, as I mentioned with the healthy skepticism, to just keep an eye out and just be mindful. Because remember, healthy skepticism is also, it's in essence like just us protecting ourselves from all the possibilities. The hooking just looks like a lot of deep connection with a person, even when, and especially so, when there isn't a lot of depth in the relationship just yet.
And when we're hooked, is it then, because then the third stage, like you said, is devaluation. Because we're hooked, when we devalued, we don't necessarily then immediately leave. But if we were devalued as the first manipulation tactic, we're like, well, you haven't actually, I'm not hooked yet, so peace out.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so once you get to the devaluation then, and you have somebody, like you said, texting you in the morning and then disappearing for 3 days. Again, I'm always trying to play like devil's advocate or like the middle person. It's like, what if the person's busy? What if they've just like, they've got a really demanding job and they want to let you know in the morning, I just wanted to say I love you, but I'm freaking busy, so I don't have time to necessarily get into a big long discussion. How do you start to pass through the difference between the two, where it's like, no, this is actually just somebody who has a lot going on in their life. They still very much care about you. And it's not a manipulation tactic versus, no, they know exactly what they're doing. They know that they've got you hooked. They know to keep you there is to send you these texts in the morning. And then they're like, well, now I have them hooked. I don't have to think about them for 3 days.
Yeah. Wow. The way you framed that was so perfect. You know, we have to also like consider, well, what's coming next. This is why it's so helpful to understand the stages and to just hold them, commit them to mind. Because usually what tends to happen next when we are truly dealing with a manipulation strategy is that we tend to get gaslit into believing that what we're saying happened didn't happen.
Right.
Traditionally, what tends to happen is that the person that didn't call will deny that they didn't call or say like, what do you mean? Like I texted you back. And so that makes, the person that's questioning like think like, well, let me look back at my phone. Like, did they text me? And so now you're questioning your own rendition of how things played out and your
Mm.
own version of reality. So if the devaluing is then transitioning into something that feels like gaslighting or something that feels like it's discounting how you experience the situation, then we're really leading down the path of manipulation versus this person was just busy.
Mm.
And it usually you can find it in the words that a person is saying. So if a person's saying, you know what, I truly was busy, but communicating with you does matter to me. That's a very different way of approaching that situation than saying like, but I did text you. What are you talking about? Right. And so that sends a person down a spiral versus helping a person feel connected and safe in the relationship, which is what the former, statement would do.
Ah, God, I love how you
Mhm.
broke that down because now really understanding it, and you said this multiple times already, but like it's the stages, right? So when
Mhm.
you have this, if it's then followed by the next stage, it becomes more and more of a manipulation tactic. Is that what I'm understanding?
Exactly, exactly. Typically, when a person tends to engage in these manipulative strategies, they tend to cycle either slowly or they rapid cycle through them.
Ooh.
So it's important for us to just very patiently collect data because we may have someone who's a slow cycler and someone who just takes their time, really massaging the love bombing stage and really getting you into that hook for an extended period of time. And then they drop off communication, right? Then you have some people that within a week's time, they'll show you all 7 stages of the cycle. And you can get an understanding of, okay, this is what I'm working with. And then you can make a determination that's a little bit prompter and quicker than what somebody who's like 6 months down the line and still in that love bombing stage might be experiencing.
And is it typically depending on the person then themselves of how they show up and they're going to work through the manipulation tactics? Or is it they recognize that I'm the easy target and so they can run through it much quicker?
I hate to say it, but they do have a radar, right? Like some people just understand that there are people who are softies, are empaths, are kind-hearted, and maybe easier to, get into their lives and really cement themselves into their lives through the love bombing stage. So there are ways in which some people, just gravitate towards people that may be targets for the manipulation strategies. But what I do want to say and emphasize is that any of us can actually fall prey to this. Like it can be anyone. So it's important to understand, what we're getting into with anyone and how all of this plays out because we can be like somebody who's very guarded and boundaried and, is a high skeptic and like all the things, right? And we can still become very involved in a cycle like this. And this is especially so if what we saw growing up is a set of cycles that looked a lot like these manipulative strategies and cycles. So if we saw something like this growing up and it's been normalized for us because we're like, well, that's what a relationship looks like, then that's what we're going to actually see as a normal type of relationship in our day-to-day lives. And so we're going to gravitate towards what feels familiar.
Mm. So in that situation, would it be, for instance, if a parent, like, can a parent love bomb a child then?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Parents engage in these strategies all the time.
Mm.
They may yell at a child aggressively, right? Or berate their child, and then go back into love bombing and say,
Mm.
but I love you, or I do it because I love you, And so or like give them like a bunch of candy so that they can feel better. And like, and sometimes it's the parents' desire to also want to get back in their child's good graces. What tends to happen is that then the child is rehooked, right? And it's a very complicated process for a child because the child is so dependent on the adult,
Mm.
and so their survival depends on being hooked to an adult, right? And so it's an easier process for them to then be hooked to this adult who then starts devaluing them again, and then starts gaslighting them, and then so forth and so on.
Yeah, well, and so do you suggest as we go through these, people start to identify if someone's like, if people are listening right now and they're like, oh my God, that's me. Yes, that's how I feel. Is it wise to then go back into your childhood and look at where it may stem from? Because if you're the type of person that may find yourselves always getting love bombed, right? That's where you know you get tripped up. It's like, oh my God, I go on these dates and I really do fall for the person, but it always feels genuine.
Mhm.
To get out of that cycle, is it wise then to go back and see who that person is representative in your childhood?
It's essential.
Mm.
We have to be able to go back into the places where the wounds originated in order to get a better understanding of them, because we are, in essence, especially when we're kids, when we're children, we're so malleable. Like our brains are like, in essence, like mimicking everything that's around us. And when we have adults in our lives that are in these cycles, we're replicating that in our child lives. And when we get into adolescence, when we have like relationships in adolescence and then into our adult lives. So we have to understand, well, where did these wounds actually originate? How did they manifest in my life? What did I see growing up? What were the feelings that I experienced whenever I was witnessing my parents in their, manipulative stages? And in which ways did those become implanted in me? Also, it helps with people with not assuming shame around the fact that they've been in these cycles. So when they can see like this came from a source that was there from the moment that you were born, right? They can actually like extract the shame and then just start doing the work to then disrupt the cycles and break out of them.
And when you say shame, it's because so many people carry the shame with them that they've been trapped or caught in these types of relationships.
Yeah, a lot of survivors of these types of relationships tend to ask the question, how did I even get into this? How did this happen to me? Especially like, as a woman, like being a strong woman, like someone who, just considers herself to be, very like attuned and socially attuned and intelligent. Like for me, I think it would be really hard to be entrapped in a relationship like that, right?
Mm.
And that goes for a lot of other women too. A lot of women think like, oh, I got this. Like, it won't happen to me. And the thing is that some people are very, very strategic about how they get into your life and how they enact that love bombing in order to get you hooked. So it can really happen to anyone, like I said before. But if you have some sort of normalization around these manipulative strategies, you can become more susceptible to being in relationships that also carry these kinds of cycles.
So I've got a question for you then. Being a psychologist, you know all of this, you can really articulate it. So
Yeah.
number 4, gaslighting. Have you been gaslit before?
Oh, yes, I have.
Okay.
Actually, I think may have a record on being gaslit
Oh shit,
because,
you got a record.
yeah,
All
I
right, let's go,
do.
homie.
I do. I
I
do.
think the reason I thank you so much for sharing this, and I'd
Yeah.
love for you, if you don't mind, sharing some examples, because to
Yeah.
your point, no matter how much you know,
Hmm.
even though you know, it's still possible that you can get trapped. And if we shame ourselves over getting trapped, right? Like, oh my God, here I am again. Or
Hmm.
be like, I'm a psychologist and I still get trapped. Like, then we can't progress. We can't improve. We can't make the adjustments because we're so much in our head about beating ourselves up over what just happened.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
thank you for sharing that. And I'd actually love to hear some
Absolutely.
stories if you don't
Yeah,
mind.
absolutely. So what I mean by record is that, I was actually in conversation with someone that I was dating, and for about an hour and a half, I was being gaslit. But the reason why it lasted an hour and a half, in part, was because I was trying to give this person an opportunity to not gaslight and almost kind of going back into the conversation, offering them more and more opportunities to backtrack and not actually say what they were saying, simply because I was like, no, this can't be so. And that happens to a lot of us. We become so connected to someone through the other, stages that we're like, it's almost like we experience a disillusionment whenever we see that, oh no, this person actually is someone that can gaslight me and can engage in toxic manipulation and isn't the person that I believe them to be. And so, there have been moments when I have actually like experienced it, just perhaps for like 2 or 3 minutes, and then that tends to be like my record breaking hour and a half of being gaslit. But it can come up in many ways. Like sometimes, people gaslight you into believing that you were in an actual relationship with them, and they might say like, no, we actually weren't in a relationship. Like I don't really know where you thought we had an actual label. And so like that can spend a lot of women come to me with like those kinds of dilemmas where they feel like they're in these situationships and they thought that they were in an actual proper relationship with someone, and it turns out that they went into this gaslighting kind of like scenario where they now found out, no, really what you thought was the reality of your relationship is not. And so that tends to happen, which is very disorienting and very scarring for a lot of people.
Take me through that. That's so freaking powerful. So
Yeah.
like, so you're saying you think you're in a relationship in the sense of all the signs, everything you've been talking about. Maybe you say I love you, or maybe you talk about your future. So to you, it's very obvious you're in a relationship. Maybe you talk about kids,
Yeah.
whatever. And then it comes up and the other person's like, we're not in a relationship. It's a situationship. Like I never said that.
Yeah.
How do you work through that? And what are the right tools that you can do in that moment to maybe clear the air before you think that you're in a relationship? Like, what's the best tactic so that you don't get burnt again? If you're like me, you watch a lot of YouTube, and I get so much freaking inspiration and motivation from all of the content that I am literally obsessed. So much so that I even wear my earpods in the shower under my shower cap. And while this is a bit of an embarrassing story, I'll share that I've actually had times when a hair growth ad or an ab machine commercial comes on and I have no way of skipping it. But now with YouTube Premium, you can enjoy every video on YouTube absolutely ad-free. This means 0 interruptions during that fire freaking interview that you're listening to, or your favorite workout session, or for the kiddos while they're laughing and learning. Get everything you love about YouTube with background play, downloads, and 0 ads. Get started with 1 month free trial of YouTube Premium. And as a heads up, guys, if you click the link, I may get a commission.
Well, the first thing to do, which of course most people are still like probably in that conversation, and it's important for them to set the standard of what they believe the actual relationship to be, right? And so like if you're in the conversation and you're telling the person, well, I believe that we already had a label that we were girlfriend and girlfriend, boyfriend and boyfriend, boyfriend and girlfriend, whatever, right? And so if that is something that you're hoping that we could continue being, because that is the perception that I had, then let's continue there. But let's collectively decide that that's the label that we're subscribing to, right? And so there needs to be like a very concrete conversation so as to not create more confusion or more space for there to be any kind of gaslighting, right? I also believe in calling things out and allowing a person to understand the impact that they're causing. So if a person feels inclined to say, you know what, that feels like gaslighting to me. And I'll tell you what gaslighting is in case you don't know what it is, because education is important. Some people really don't know that they're gaslighting. And my rendition of what this relationship is that we were boyfriend and girlfriend. Your rendition is that we were not in some sort of a relationship. It's not matching, and it's making me feel like a bit confused, or it's making me feel like our realities aren't matching. But I know what I have subscribed to, and it is this, right? I think that clarity can be very helpful, but also labeling and allowing everybody to be on the same page about what's happening. Whenever anybody is stating that gaslighting is happening, what I tend to hear from folks is that they feel very empowered because they have language to actually label their experience versus just being in this ball of confusion, which tends to happen to people all the time. They're like, what's happening? Is that really what happened? Let me just go back.
Am I going crazy?
Am I going crazy? Let me think about every little word that was said here, because I need to now go back into the previous conversation and see if, am I right? Are they right? And so like there's this like wordplay and this word jujitsu that people start to get into, and it's usually unproductive. So what's most helpful is for everything to be called out for what it is, and for there to be a roadmap as to how you're going to continue in that relationship with the explicit label so as to not cause any further confusion or opportunity for more gaslighting.
I freaking love this so much. Knowing myself now, I think I would be like, okay, let's write this down. I want you to initial it. Yeah, like almost just like binary.
Right.
Binary.
Right,
You
right.
said this. But as you were talking, I was like, okay, it's so genius. Why don't people do it more often? Like, why don't people just go, hey, let's just talk. Okay, well, how do you see this relationship? And I think it may stem from confidence, maybe, but then also, do you think it's potentially rejection, where people are worried about getting rejected or worried about putting too much pressure on the other partner to try to get clarification? Like, what is it that's stopping people from just communicating upfront, like you just broke down?
It's vulnerability. People have to be really vulnerable to be able to say, this is what I desire in this relationship. This is what my need is. And I'm hoping that this relationship can supplement that need. And I'm hoping that I can supplement your needs in a way that's healthy and interdependent. And can we proceed in this way? We're not socialized to have those conversations in that way. And so what happens is that when we want to have them, we get into our emotions. We start experiencing everything that feels entirely too vulnerable, whether it's guilt or shame or anxiety, or like all of our primal emotions start coming up. And so I think it's a very emotional process and one that we're not trained how to navigate. And so unfortunately, it leads us into these spaces where there's a lot of confusion, where there's, situationships that are built. And there's also, thereafter, there can be a lot of tumultuous or chaotic kind of interactions to try and figure things out. And sometimes it lands people in a place where they just can't be together, which is really unfortunate because truly what needed to happen was just a very straightforward conversation.
Yeah, so that you're not spending the next year or 2 years thinking or hoping a relationship's one thing and then
Hmm.
realizing it's not. Because I think that that's partly maybe where a lot of the emotion comes from. It's like, oh my God, have I just spent 2 years like with this
Yeah.
person that I thought was going to be the one, and now
Yeah.
they're not. And then you beat yourself up. And to your point, you go back and you're like, they actually tell me that
Hmm.
they loved me? Like I swear they did,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
the cycle continues.
Hmm.
And then there was actually something else that you just said with it, which is the need, the vulnerability, and then saying what you need.
Hmm.
It only just dawned on me, like us women have basically been trained to never speak up about our needs because we're perceived as being needy.
Hmm.
And so I think that our own emotions and what we've been taught of, like, you don't want to be needy, you don't want to seem needy.
Hmm.
And so that may stop us from even saying a need. And I think
Yeah.
of them as very different.
Yeah.
But I think that, at least for me, I've been taught that they're the kind of one and the same. That if I speak a need, it means that I'm needy.
Hmm. I mean, it's a really tragic socialization for all of us, really, because we're not only taught not to express our need, but we're taught to be self-sacrificial and to service the needs of others, of everyone around us, whether it's our partners, our children, and be nurturing in every role that we play, even if we're business women, like be nurturing in those roles and service the needs of other
Mhm.
people in the business world. But then we're all the way down on the priority list. And so we have to literally like surface from all of that socialization, which is incredibly hard, and then actually express to the person that we're most vulnerable with, which is usually someone who we want to be in partnership with, that we have a need. It's really hard. It's a hard thing to ask of anyone, but I think that with a bit of at least the conscious understanding that that's something that we have to get into and having these kinds of conversations about the fact that we need to surface from the need, from not just having a need, but also expressing the need in a very vulnerable way. I think that can be a step one, in the right direction.
I love that. And then if people are listening right now, to know that, like, I like to kind of almost weigh options, right? So
Hmm.
it's like, okay, it's good. You got the option to speak up to your partner, to say that you have the need. Totally get it. It's going to be uncomfortable. Maybe you feel really,
Hmm.
nervous right now. But then the other option is spending years and years and years wondering
Oh my.
and hoping and
Yeah.
waiting. And so I like to
Ooh.
kind of be very honest with those types of things, because if you then lay those out as like, those are my options, hopefully people go, oh shit, well, I need to say my need.
Hmm. In therapy, we have this concept called content versus process. And content is basically what we're saying, but process is everything that's not being said. And it's everything that's happening, right? It's almost like, like the elephants in the room. And so whenever we can call out the process and actually say it, it actually diffuses all of those strong emotions that are associated with it. For example, if we can say, it's making me really nervous to have this conversation with you because I have to be incredibly vulnerable right now. That's the process. That's what's happening, but no one's calling it out. No one's saying it. But it actually diffuses the nervousness that the person feels upon expressing that vulnerability, and it actually builds a stronger connection between the two individuals that are having the conversation.
Dude, that's so lovely. I love that so much. Okay, I want to go back to something that you said earlier that I didn't want to interrupt you, but you said so you had the call, the hour-and-a-half call where you started to spot the gaslighting signs, and because you're like, no, not them, you tried to give them reasons. You said you asked them questions to see if they could come back from it, like give them an opportunity. What questions were you asking?
Well, the questions were in reference to us planning, a travel.
Okay.
So it was like a first travel, and I was identifying some of the things that I like whenever I travel, right? And so I had expressed them, but they weren't honored, right? And so like just, things that are essential to me, like, some things around timeliness, and things that just help me to feel settled whenever I'm traveling with someone. And they kept going back to, I've never heard you say that. I said, but I did say that. So and that is a very common experience that people have in that gaslighting transaction, where you're saying, no, I did say that, but did I say that? So now you have to like kind of further question whether or not you actually got into those logistics. But I knew I got into the logistics, and I really wanted that person to say, no, I really did hear you say that, and that we could continue thereafter, and that there wouldn't be that experience of gaslighting. So, even when it was like something benign, there were already some of the other signs that I started noticing, where I started piecing the puzzle together with the gaslighting, some of the devaluing. Some of the devaluing came with, being told that my standards were too high around traveling. So the thing about that is that, then I have to wonder, like, well, how is this person perceiving me? Like, are my standards too high?
Right.
And so should I self-suppress and shrink, or should I be this person that I am, that has these standards? And so like all of those things started to be data.
Please take me through that standard thing before we go on to the data, because this is fascinating. How did you process that of, am I asking too much, or no, this is absolutely my right to say my need?
Well, because I've done a lot of self-love work and self-reflection, and of course, as a psychologist, how could I not be self-reflective? But I've already taken myself through all of those things even prior to this interaction. And of course, it helped that I knew the signs, right? But I had to take a pause from the conversation, which I always urge people to do, because when you're entangled in that conversation, there's going to be a lot of you going back and forth and almost playing like, a semantics game. And you get caught up in that, and then you spiral in it. And it can be, very toxic for the person that's on the receiving end of that gaslighting. So I always, if there is an opportunity, I always instruct anyone who is being captured into that gaslighting cycle to just extract themselves from it, which is what I did. I extracted myself from it. And what I did next was one of the things that I also help people to do, which is I started tuning in with how I was experiencing the moment. And the tuning in is very layered. Like I started thinking, well, what are the thoughts that are going through my mind about how I'm experiencing this person right now? Well, I felt that they they were a little bit more irritable than I thought really the conversation called for. That felt a bit more on the aggressive end than I would have hoped, from someone that I'm hoping to connect with in this way. That's something that I couldn't think about while I'm still trying to make sure that they're not gaslighting me, right? Then it's, I also had to think about, well, how am I feeling? What are my actual feelings? Let me call them out. Let me name them. I was actually really sad because I liked this person and I wanted things to work out in the ways that I had anticipated, but they weren't going to if this person really had this intention on gaslighting me. That wasn't something that I was willing to continue in. And so there was sadness, the grief, right? That's an essential part of what we need to go through. And then I also needed to check in with my body. How am I feeling like in my body? I felt like I had some sensations in my chest because I was like really stressed in the moment. And so all of that became a part of how I stepped back and honored myself. How am I really? How am I doing? Forget the transaction that just occurred. Let me go back into myself, check in with myself, and offer myself exactly what I need in this moment. I actually took a walk outside and just explored nature a little bit in my backyard. and I offered myself an opportunity to reground. And that's something that we typically, we're not trained to do these things, to step back, to honor ourselves, to check in, and to then ground ourselves after
Wow.
we've been uplifted and uprooted by such a, just a negatively stimulating situation like gaslighting.
Yeah, and with this, that's so beautiful. I love the stepping back. Everything you just laid out is so powerful. I've never really thought about how to deal with gaslighting in that moment and to come back to yourself. And you said you'd done the work before. Obviously,
Hmm.
someone listening that may not have done that work. How do you look through what are my standards,
Hmm.
and what are the standards I'm not willing to lower myself to? Because we're in those moments where someone's like, you just got high standards. You're just really like high maintenance.
Hmm.
To your point, a lot of us who haven't done the work are going to squish ourselves.
Hmm.
We're going to make ourselves smaller
Yeah.
so that we now fit into that mold of that person that maybe we're trying to attract.
Yeah.
How, what are the steps for somebody to actually write out those standards so that if they found themselves with someone saying that, they know, oh, go back to my cheat sheet. Do not lower your standards. This is who you are.
Hmm. You know, it's going to be painful, but it's essential for us to go back into the moments when we felt shrunken and small, and actually reflect on those moments and realize what was happening in those moments, and then think about what we're no longer willing to accept in connection to what happened already. So, um, for example, I had one client, and I think that this happens, often enough for a lot of folks, where um, their partner, whenever they would feel really stressed, and especially at work, would come home with a lot of rage and anger. And so they would yell at anything. Everything would tick them off. And so they had this like really short fuse and inability to really process the stress and not place it in their home and
Mhm.
onto their partner. And so my client, who was the partner, would oftentimes feel very shrunken in those moments and very helpless and not able. And it's really unfortunate because now my client was a target, right? A target of a lot of this aggression and rage. And so, the berating and displacing onto my client was something that she decided she would no longer be tolerating. So that was a non-negotiable now that she understood was to be a part of her life moving forward. So in her dating world, now she no longer admitted anyone who would displace any kind of anger or aggression onto her. So that was, just like one variation of it, right? I know that, for me, I've had people in my life that have had like different ways in which they've displaced. It's never been to that level, but I think that it, I have had to set my own standards around like whether or not, I've been able, I can love someone with something that feels like a non-negotiable to me, which I now know is not something that I'm willing to accept. I have my list, and the list definitely came from places where I've been wounded, but now that list I carry with me into every kind of dating situation that I have so that I can know, okay, whatever it is that happens here, I understand what my non-negotiables are, and everything else, there's space for compromise, for grace, and for compassion.
God, I love that. As you were talking about that, how to do that work,
Hmm.
I think it's so beautiful to be able to say, okay, this is from my past, and now I'm going to use that as a tool to then help me dictate who's the right person for me.
Hmm.
And that response is super freaking powerful. And I think even, and I'd actually love to hear your thoughts on this, even if it's something that may seem petty,
Hmm.
like there's certain things that from my childhood are really freaking petty that I've been scarred from. And I've just told my husband when I first met, this is me. I'm not going to change.
Hmm.
And so you may think it's me being too fussy, high standards, but this is where it comes from and this is why. So I kind of basically said you have to either love it or lump it,
Hmm.
and so my husband being amazing, he was just like, of course, like I totally understand, we've all got our scars. And so it was something silly like my food, for instance,
Hmm.
like as a kid, I have childhood trauma over the fact that my dad would make me eat food that I didn't like.
Hmm.
Trauma over it.
Hmm.
And so now when I go to a restaurant, I'm the fussiest eater. And like if the waiter brings something and it's wrong and there's sauce on it and I won't scrape, I'll send it back.
Hmm.
And it takes a very patient partner to be with me to say, of course, babe, like, what do you need in that moment? Because it actually comes from a childhood trauma.
Yeah.
Now, if I was with a different person, if I hadn't done that internal work, they may belittle me and make it seem petty, which actually, when I think about it and even I say it like, it's kind of petty, but it's still something that's important to me. So whether people think it's petty or not, I still do it. But if I have a partner that just mocked me all the time for doing that, if I had a partner that just kept saying like, oh my God, you're so fussy, like, why do you want it like that? You need to stop being so high, you know, have your high standards. I think I would start to feel shame around this thing that I actually had trauma from as a child.
Yeah, and re-triggered. This is, it's an opportunity for us whenever, if anybody is like, in a situation where they feel as though the person that they're with isn't creating safety, but is instead just adding to the experience of feeling triggered, then that's yet again data, right? I think that whenever we're in connection with someone where the connection requires a lot of vulnerability, but in that vulnerability there's re-traumatization and re-triggering, then that is the clue to help us to then transition from that situation. In part, not only because, that's a toxic cycle, but also because that person is reflecting their own wounding onto you. And they're further wounding you and placing their hurt on you so that you now carry it, rather than creating a safety container for you so that you can be the fussy eater that you wish to be, right? And so there's all of that. I have, my own like versions of this, like with the cold. I despise the cold. I'm also, I'm Caribbean, so I was born like in this really warm place. So warmth to me feels like a hug. And, I've had people in my life that I've dated that have actually warmed the car before I got into their car so that I could feel warmth, because it mattered to them that I feel safe, that I feel comfort. And so that is a very different scenario than someone fussing at me because I don't like, a draft coming into the apartment or something like that. It's a very different scenario. I have to then fight for my comfort with someone that isn't honoring it, versus just being me with someone that is creating that safety container. It's a very different kind of relationship to have. And it's important for us to always, like figure out how to lean in the direction, or at least if we feel invested enough, help a person to then create that container with us.
And I think in those moments, right, you feel really seen. Because
Yeah.
someone knows you and it's like they've thought about you and you've like gone into the car and it's all warm because they've like,
Yeah.
even that is just a great sign of someone that really cares.
Yeah. And like cares to nurture, which is, such an added step, beyond even caring. It's like, I care so much about you that I want to create the very scenario and situation where you feel like you can be your best self. I can't be my best self in the cold. There is no way. And I actually live, in the Northeast, not for very long, but I live in the Northeast. And every time that it gets cold, I always think, why do I live here? Why do I live somewhere where my face hurts in the winter? It makes absolutely no sense. But, I think that me being able to then connect with someone that does something so incredibly basic, but so incredibly nurturing, but nurturing in a way where it's almost like love in action. They're expressing love through their action, not even saying it, but just saying, I care so deeply about you, that the very basic ways in which you need comfort is something that I am willing to provide or help with. I mean, that's I feel like a really good setup and a good foundation for us to, continue in a healthy way. And so if people are able to offer us those containers in whatever variation that may look like, I think that that's a healthy setup. And, always hold on to that healthy skepticism.
Yeah, I love that. You got to add that at the end, right?
Right.
Okay, great. So we're at number 4, which was
Yeah.
gaslighting, and now number 5, which is submission.
Yeah. So submission is,
What up, homie? I got something free and new to share with you right now.
How often are you visited by that negative voice in your head telling you that you're not smart enough, that you're not good enough, experienced enough, not fill in the blank? One of the most powerful things you can learn to do in life is to turn that negative voice into your bestie. And I want to teach you how to do that and so much more in my 4 steps to becoming confident workshop. And guys, the most amazing thing is you can actually register for completely free for this workshop. So click the link on your screen and I'll see you on the inside.
Gaslighting can be very debilitating, especially when we don't know that gaslighting is happening and we can't call it out as a result. So what happens is that people tend to spiral in their thoughts and then they start to self-deprecate. And when people self-deprecate, if I were to self-deprecate and say, I've erred, I made a mistake, I've just upset this person, what tends to be the natural response is to then try and please. This is a lot where people pleasing comes from, right? Like we want to please and get back on someone's good graces and like feel the warmth again. And so we're already like in that moment in a state of submission because we're at the mercy of whatever this person wants us to do in order to get back into that happy stage. So submission is, in essence, it's almost like the second hooking. So we're hooked at the first hook, right? Like euphoria, everything's feeling great. And then when submission kicks in, the hook is a little bit deeper.
Wow. And okay, so and that is purely because you don't necessarily know how to also handle the gaslighting. So you kind of just take a step back because you do believe it's you.
You start believing that it's you, and most times you're kind of not winning the battle. So when a person is gaslighting, they're dead set on being right. And so if they're right, then who's going to be wrong? It's going to be you. And so, oftentimes what tends to happen is that because we're talking about cycles, because we're talking about this happening on an ongoing basis, that submission gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And a person starts to internalize that they are, a person that can't be right, is always like making the mistakes in the relationship, always making someone angry. Like all these kinds of narratives start to become like a part of what people internalize, and they submit even more so. So whenever people tell me, why didn't I get out sooner? Typically, it's because they entered into that submission stage. And so a lot of their thinking was that they were the ones that were creating their own circumstance. And so it becomes a lot harder to get out of a situation where you feel like someone is doing something to you versus you're the one that's messing up.
I didn't want to interrupt you. I've just had a massive aha moment. So the thing that I get asked a lot is, Lisa, I used to have my confidence. I lost it. How do I get it back? And I'm always like, how do people lose their confidence? Oh my God, it's exactly what you just said.
Yeah.
If I got trapped in this cycle of manipulation and I got to the gaslighting number 4 and then I start to submit, it's like, oh my God, okay, maybe it is me. You do that time and time again for years and years. Over time, of course, you're going to lose your confidence because you think you're always doing shit wrong.
It internalizes and it becomes the general script that you have about yourself. And so now you're just the person that's always messing everything up. And it's being actually reinforced by the words that that person's actually saying to you. Like, why do you always make me feel this way? Right? Like you're always like messing everything up in this relationship. And so when a person is in submission, they're chronically saying, I'm sorry. That's why whenever, especially with women, I always like notice like when we say I'm sorry a lot, I always wonder, like, who made you believe that you are always at fault, so much so that you say sorry almost by default with things that you shouldn't even be saying sorry about, right? And so we get caught up in this internalized belief that we are like always erring and unworthy.
How the hell then do you break that cycle of the submission? If you find yourself, obviously we've gone through each one, so right up to this point, you've given us the things of if you gaslight, this is what you do, or if you've been gaslit. But with the submission piece then, what are the things you've broken down a couple where it's like if you start to question, okay, it's me, let me back off, the pleasing thing. So those are all signs that someone can watch out for that they're now in the submission stage.
Yeah.
What are the things they can do to pull themselves out of that submission stage?
Oftentimes people tend to get out of submission because they feel desperate. They can no longer resist the treatment that they're getting, but also the way that they're feeling. The way that submission feels to a person is almost like a depressive state. It's almost like immobilizing, which is why it can be so hard to get out of. It's, you feel like you're kind of frozen, right? And so with everything, although it sounds a little bit cliche, like the very first thing that can be very empowering for someone to step out of that cycle is the knowledge, right? They say knowledge is power, right? It really is. If we have the information at our disposal, even people that are still in that submissive state, they do get aha moments, and they do get into this process of being able to see, okay, like this is not okay and it's not natural, and I'm not always airing. And so like being able to get into that point of realization like tilts the scale, and it allows them to then start questioning a lot of the other things that are happening, which can be a source of empowerment for a lot of people because they can self-actualize and motivate and get out of that, that depressive kind of frozen state that they've been stuck in for however long, whenever they have the knowledge to be able to localize and name and categorize their experiences. So knowledge is going to be really, really critical. And then the other thing is that, whenever we're in these experiences, like I mentioned, the word mobilizing, like immobile, right? Like we become frozen, we become stuck. Our bodies also register all of that. So when our bodies are in a state of chronic stress, we're also feeling the immobilization that's happening in our bodies, meaning that our bodies are heavy, they're tired, right? And so it's going to be really critical for us to also like get out of those stressed, traumatized states by getting our bodies into a healthier place, especially our nervous system into a healthier place. Because whenever we're talking about being in an immobilized state, we're talking about being in a nervous system state of dissociation or freeze or fawn, which is, being in a nervous system shutdown state, meaning that we have been so chronically in a state of stress or chronically in a state of submission that we're basically like frozen there or there by default. And so if we can train our nervous system to then re-energize, to restore, to recover, then we can also do some of the body-based work that's going to be really essential to get us out of this state of submission, in addition to more of the cognitive stuff we already talked about.
Holy smokes. So what are a couple of the key things for someone to do to try and get themselves out of that state?
I like to start off with something that's easy because, when people are in that state, they feel so much and they're already in, like in survival mode, right? So what's easy to remember is that people need to breathe. And oftentimes we don't breathe for long enough. We need at least 5 minutes of deep breaths for our bodies to catch up to the fact that we're trying to re-energize it. And so if people can actually get into the habit of at least breathing, I mean, there's so many things, right? We can do body scans and we can do progressive muscle relaxation, which is a tensing of the muscles and then a relaxation of the muscles to help release some of that absorbed stress response that's captured in the muscles. There's so many things. But if you can tell a person, listen, why don't you try breathing for 5 minutes for the next 30 days? Just give yourself that. There's 1,440 minutes in a day. If you can just capture 5 of those minutes wherever you find them and breathe into your body and re-energize your nervous system to work in your favor rather than against you, then you're going to be on a better path towards mobilization and getting yourself out of toxic cycles in your body and in your mind.
Oh, God, thank you. I love these tactics. And I'm sure everyone's like, who's got the time? It's like, well, you pee. So like, can you do the breathing exercise while you're peeing?
Yeah.
Okay.
And
I wasn't sure.
a lot of people that are really busy, right? I work with a lot of corporations and, some of these corporations have like the busiest people you could think of. And I always tell them, okay, if you're walking from one meeting to the next, you can walk and breathe, right? If you're going to heat up your lunch, for example, and it's, 3 minutes in the microwave, do 3 minutes. And while you're waiting for your food to heat up, do those 3 minutes. When you wake up in the morning, you can breathe and do a gratitude practice, a mental gratitude practice, and just breathing into what you're grateful for. Like there are so many moments, at least when when you're segueing to sleep, there's so many moments when we can actually like capture this. And you can be talking to someone in deep breathing and they have no idea you're deep breathing, right? So you can actually be in a meeting and while someone's presenting or someone else is talking, you can do your deep breaths. And you can actually get that practice in there without like needing to actually carve out any time in your day that feels like an added task for you to actually do something that's going to be health promoting for you in the moment, but also in the long term.
I love that. So we started at cloud 9, which is the love bombing phase. Then you get hooked. Then it's devaluation, then gaslighting, then submission. And what's after the submission?
So after submission, what happens next is loss of self. So a person actually starts to lose elements of who they are, and they start believing that they are someone else. So remember, like, submission basically changes the narrative, the script that you have of yourself. And eventually that starts to internalize, and you start believing, well, I'm a bad person, or I'm the girlfriend that constantly, triggers my partner and makes them do bad things to me. Right. And so, like, there is this idea of yourself that morphs and changes in relation to this relationship. For 38 years, you've been the person that you've been, right? And now, in this 1.5 years that you've been in this relationship, all of a sudden you're this bad person. Not really, right? It's just that you've been in this cycle and looped into this stage of submission often enough that now you've changed the general script that you have of yourself, and you've lost the person that you have been for 38 years, and you've adopted a new version of yourself, which is why a lot of this work requires that we go back to ourselves, that we come home to ourselves, that we reconnect with who we are. Within my work, I also add the element of the spirit. I work with mind, body, and spirit, very holistic. And there's a reason for that, because in the spirit element, the way that I reference to it in my work is that we lose connection with ourselves, or with the greater world, with the universe, with whatever we believe in, or with relationships with others. And usually this loss of self is captured in that we lose track of who our core selves is in these relationships, and we develop another version that is fitting to the relationship that we've been in and the cycle that we've been entangled in. So it's really essential for us to actually reconnect to ourselves and reconnect to who we truly are, our core selves and our true selves, in order to detract from this loss of self, or this other version that we've adopted in this cycle.
Oh God, it's heartbreaking.
Mm-hmm.
And in the scenario you just laid out, if you spent, let's say, 34 or 37 years, however long you said, in your true self, and then you meet someone and you go through these stages, you start to change. I can understand. I'm not going to say it's easy, but I can see a way where you can go, okay, who was I a couple of years ago? How do I get back to that person? But what if you've been either in a relationship for a long time, and so you don't actually remember who you were, or you were just young when you met that person, and now you've been with them for 10, 15, 20 years. And so now the idea of knowing who you are at your core, you literally have no idea.
Yeah.
How would you actually even work through that?
Well, it's about connecting to who you are when you are your best self. So whatever version that is right now, and what happens, or who is around you, or what are you doing, or how are you feeling when you feel like your best self? Like, really, again, data collection, right? Like, start collecting the data within the moments that you feel like your most elevated self, and then start working towards more of that. And so that's, I think, a really healthy start for anybody that's just like trying to get through the weeds and doesn't really know, like, how do I get to what that core self is? Well, first, let's get you to a more balanced self. And the more balanced self means that we have to add more of what feels good and more of where you feel grounded. Let's take whatever that is and add more of that in your life. And so eventually, the more grounded you are, the more mental clarity you have, the more capacity to be more attuned to yourself, the more that we can finally find, like, who that core self is.
And so when you say that, sorry, I love tactics.
Yeah.
So, and I'm like, if I was to
I
write
do
down
too.
on a piece of paper,
Yeah.
so going back into the core self, so I love the, like, right now, what's the best version of you? Is it, I was very proud of myself that I showed up for my sister last week when she needed me. Like, is that what you would write down? So now showing up for someone else is something that makes you feel good. That's your higher value. Like, how do you actually break that down?
Yeah, I mean, that's a beautiful example. Absolutely. So it's in all of those moments, because, like, your true self is in there, right? Whoever that version of you is there, or that version of you, a portion of that version of you is there, and you can just build upon that. And so it's all in all of the micro moments that we have in our lives, where we can, just point to them and say, like, this is something that feels like a value that I want to hold on to. Being present for my sister, or, being a source of maybe like help for my nephew, or being somebody who people can talk to very easily. Like that's a quality that I love in myself. Or, being somebody that feels like they take time for themselves, whatever it may be. Like it can be so many things. Just adding more of that into our lives can start to replicate the level of connection that we have to our core selves, but also it can add to our resilience, because the more that we can actually feel like we are connected to what feels good to us, the more that we're going to feel more grounded. And it just becomes like an upward spiral. All of it just starts, fitting together in a way that feels more positive than the negative experiences that you would have had while you were still in the cycle.
Yeah, because I love that. And as you were talking, I was thinking about a story that another guest was telling me about how they were trying to build their confidence and stand up for themselves more. And they said, look, the first thing that I did was like, I just told the barista at the coffee shop how to spell my name correctly. Like that was like, they couldn't even fathom telling their person or their partner or standing up for themselves when they're being, manipulated, or, especially when it's someone close to you. I think it's sometimes even harder than to do it with a stranger. And so their answer was like, just do something simple like that, where it doesn't have to bother people. But now, to your point, like you can go back to that and go, you know what, I was really proud of myself that I stood up for myself and I just was very clear, that's not how you spell my name. And so that becomes the part of the core identity that you can start to develop as you start to go upwards in spiral. I really like that phrase, by the way.
Absolutely. I love, the examples around standards, right? Like, especially as women, like it's important for us to identify in which ways are we subscribing to the standards that we desire for ourselves, and then how can we add more of that into our lives, and then hold other people accountable to also upholding those standards with us, right? Because like whenever you get lost in that submission or lost in your sense of self, standards also get compromised in that process. And so it's critical for us to either identify what standards could look like for us if we haven't been able to really burgeon them and manifest them and put them in place, or to go back to the standards that we held on to before that helped us to feel steady and well, and be able to then organize our lives around those standards.
Yeah, I love that. And then the other thing that I also do is, who is the person I want to be, right? Because it's like, I don't beat myself up for sometimes being triggered, for sometimes having maybe an emotional response that I think I could have controlled better. Like things like that, I used to shame myself, blame myself, guilt myself. And then I realized, okay, it just makes me feel worse. So now I just go, well, Lisa, that wasn't your best self. Like I kind of say, even in that voice, like, you weren't your best self, Lisa. But like the future me wants to be this person. And so now I don't beat myself up. It projects me forward. And when you said spiral up, that really hit me very well, because I think about every day, how do I spiral up? And it becomes these tiny little stepping stones that we start to do, where it's like, okay, I wasn't great. I can actually change my behavior. How am I going to change my behavior next time? Because that's the person I want to become. And just like anything, I think of it as like a skill set. That becoming the person you actually want to be means that you have to adopt and practice a bunch of skill sets that accumulate over time.
Yeah. You know what I think tends to help folks, and I actually learned this by doing it myself about 14 years ago, is actually visualizing this person. So you visualize Lisa in 2023. What does she dress like? What does she look like? What kinds of mannerisms does she have? What's the backdrop of, where she's situated when you're visualizing her? Like I visualized myself back then, I visualized myself with a bookshelf behind me. I love reading. So I was like, and now I have my own book. Yeah. So now
How
I can.
crazy is that,
I
homie?
know. Isn't that amazing? Like just a visualization that was so concrete, down to the very details. Like, what do you smell in that room? What are the ways in which you are, in essence, like walking into the room even, right? Like who's around you? And so that visualization and being able to really think concretely about who is this person and what is around them can be really helpful in then navigating towards that. Because oftentimes, like even when we create lists, sometimes we don't really visualize the list. We just like write it down. But when we can actually step into an idea of how that can come to life, it can be even more motivating. And also, for any of us who really need to be able to like look towards something, it can be very helpful to have something to look towards too, because we already have that image in our minds about like where are we headed.
And is that really what people are doing when they say, because I hear a lot of my friends say, I manifested him into my life. Now, I personally do not like the word manifest, only because I have the assumption that it means you close your eyes, you hope for something to happen. And I think that doesn't propel you into taking action. And I'm all very action oriented. But in what you're just saying actually is a different way of me thinking through manifestation. And I think it's the building blocks that maybe allow you to build the life, or saying yes and no to the things that come at you. So for instance, as you were saying, I was visualizing the bookshelf behind me. People, I think, could do that with partners as well, right? And then in visualizing the type of partner, the way they're going to treat you, the way they're going to talk to you, the way they're going to, interact with you.
Yeah.
I think now almost gives you like bumpers, like in a bowling alley, so that if somebody actually steps out of those bumpers that doesn't align with the person that you're looking for, it almost becomes an automatic no now.
Yeah.
And if you don't visualize that, if you don't actually put in those bumpers, I think that could potentially, and I'd love for you to either debunk it or agree, the visualization, if you don't have it, now you're removing the bumpers, and now you're allowing people in your life that may not fit the person you wanted, and now you're just responding to a feeling they're giving you.
And you're also getting lost in the whatever that relationship morphs into, and you're not actually being an active agent in creating or co-creating the relationship that you desire based on the parameters that you put together for yourself. And so I think that that's probably an added risk that happens. So I would say yes to what you said, and I love the analogy. It's beautiful. And then also, what we don't want is for a person to go in the direction of the potential of loss of self, right? And so it's important to have certain parameters, write them down, visualize them, really lean in the direction of even like, I like the idea of, because like sometimes we visualize something and then we forget about it, and years later we may come back to it. I like the idea of returning back to what we wrote down, or returning back to the image that we, had in our minds, and all of the different senses that we experience in that imagery process, because it allows us to then go back to what we know holds true, which is, this is what I desire for my life. And then whoever steps into your world, you're going to continue to also like understand, like, this is what needs to fit, rather than, oh, this person's great and they're not fitting, or they're not holding the standards that I desire, but I'm just going to go in this direction, and it's an easy way to get lost in.
Yeah. All right, we got number 7, gal. Stage 7.
Yes. So stage 7 is emotional addiction, and emotional addiction is tricky, because now that you've already entered that process of losing yourself, you're just, in essence, going off of emotion, and your emotions are being fed in this process where what you desire right now is just to go back into what feels like the healthy place, which is love bombing. And so, in essence, like, everything that you do is to try and get back into that stage. But you're already in a process where everything that happens in the relationship is just feeding emotions. Emotional addiction is, in essence, that, right? Like, you're trying to get that emotional hit, and the dopamine hit, which is, in essence, what you get whenever you get back into that reconciliation stage, into that love bombing stage. And so you're doing everything that you can to get that emotional hit. And eventually, when you get back into it, then it leaves you, in essence, it leaves you vulnerable to then what happens next, which is you going back into being hooked, and then devalued, and then gaslit, and then so forth and so on, and back into the cycle.
And how do you start to then identify that now you're emotionally addicted? And if you don't address it, you're about to get into the love bombing cycle. What are the things that you can identify that signal to you that this is the stage that you're in. And then when you're in that, how do you make sure that you don't then get back into the freaking love bombing? Because to your point, it feels bloody good, especially when you've just been through all those stages.
Yeah.
And now you end up feeling really shitty about yourself.
Well, something that people can do in order to really understand, okay, this is exactly what's happening, is understand that all of these things are connected to another human. That the shame and the guilt and the anxiety and the worry and will they leave and are they gonna, love me again and all of those things are tied directly to that person. If you extract yourself from that person just mentally, right? And you experience yourself as not having any of those things, any of those qualities, the shame, the loss of self, the guilt, any of those things, then there is a cycle that's involved there, and there's a person that is feeding that cycle with you. And so the first point of recognition is there is another person that's there that's contributing to this, and that allows a person to then create some level of extraction in their minds and compartmentalizing the situation. Like there's a manipulative strategy that's happening. There is a person that's responsible for that manipulation. That person is outside of me. There is a person that is, in essence, victimizing me. And that person isn't me. I'm not the person that is, causing the chaos, but chaos is being brought onto me. And so when we can actually do that mental separation, that allows us to then see the full picture of everything. And that's when people sometimes they need a moment, because when they get into that realization, they say, oh my goodness, I can't believe that this is happening. And even when they have that realization, they can very easily still get back into those cycles because they're very powerful. However, the more that we can extract ourselves mentally and say, this is what it is, this is what it is, and then finally get into a place where we, in essence, don't want to be in that cycle anymore, then the cycle breaking journey begins. And that's when people can start the extraction process and start developing ways to disconnect from the other person. Now, it isn't always easy, and sometimes, it can be dangerous for some folks. So it's important for people to be wise and strategic and put a plan in place, to be able to extract themselves from anybody who has these toxic elements. But it is, the first point of insight is going to be really essential, because that's going to be the moment where a person can actually disconnect themselves from the circumstance itself.
Ooh, okay, so what do you do then? What does disconnecting actually look like? Is it deleting them from your phone? Because to your point, you even said, even when you realize it, you definitely hope that, oh my God, once you have the recognition, the aha moment hits you, it's all over, right? And they're good. They're going to walk away. They're going to find the great relationship. But to your point, the love bombing feels so damn good that even with the recognition, you may end up there. So how do you prevent yourself in that moment of recognition to go, okay, I'm not going to beat myself up, but I know humans it well enough, right? You've just said, I just watched an episode of Women of Impact, and I just heard that, that I may go back there.
Yeah.
So in order for me to make sure that I don't go back there, what are the things people can do?
Well, people need to ask themselves, what am I looking for here? What is this love that I believe that this person is the only one that can supplement this love in this way, right? Because if we're going back into wanting to be loved in this profound way, then there's something that we're seeking there. And it's important to understand that too, right? And we all have our variations of it, right? It's just critical for us to also understand, what is it that I'm seeking? Is it acceptance, right, from this person? Is it to be really seen in the ways that I'm seen in this very, very compartmentalized love bombing stage, right? And then dig into the layers. Where was I not seen? Or when did I not feel seen? Or when did I first not feel seen, right? Going back into the origins of where the wound developed. And that's when stuff starts getting really heavy in terms of the healing, but it is very, very necessary, because when we're able to get into the layers of our own wounding, especially if wounding has happened even before this relationship took root, then it can offer us an opportunity to then understand ourselves better and understand what we're seeking and why we're seeking that love bombing stage with such fervor.
Have you been in that stage before, the emotional addiction stage?
Yeah. Actually, when I was 25, I was engaged, and I actually didn't know that any of this was happening until I then went into my doctorate and learned about it.
What?
Yeah.
Seriously?
And I was like, oh my goodness. I
Oh shit.
couldn't believe that that was something that was in my life. And I think that that happens for a lot of us. I was like, trying to appease my partner, trying to find ways to get back into that wonderful feeling. And in reality, I was just getting right back into a cycle. And so, the moments when we have that realization can be really hard for us because in those moments, we're also having to recognize that we've been in a place that has been incredibly toxic, and now we have to claim that we've been in a toxic relationship. And that's really hard for a lot of people, right? To like enter that point of recognition and to self-identify as a survivor of like toxic cycles, right? But I also found it to be incredibly empowering. And I started empowering all the women around me with the knowledge that they needed. And then, of course, then I just developed, into being a psychologist that was really passionate about all of this in order to safeguard people from the toxic effects of a toxic relationship, because these effects can last us a lifetime sometimes. They can last generations when we're not in healing, and then we start, being in those trauma responses and modeling that to our children. And so it can be, something that can have just very, very detrimental effects. And so I believe in being able to now recognize it in my own relationships, which I tend to do now that I know better, right? And then also to help educate everybody else, because we need the tools to no longer get into these cycles that can be so life-changing and life-shifting in such awful ways.
Well, could you imagine if you didn't do your doctorate or you didn't
I could have very easily, and I actually went into my doctorate. Well, my master's first, but my master's and then my doctorate 3 months after I left that relationship. So it was literally right after.
Wow.
And I got an opportunity to learn right away what all of this was. And it was very liberating. And, I'm so grateful, but I want everyone to know this. Like, I think we all deserve a right to have at our disposal the information that can shield us and protect us from all of this.
Yeah, in everything we've been talking about today, I've literally been having like these flashbacks. So my very first boyfriend, I started dating when I was 15, and I was teased and bullied, and I didn't have any boyfriends, and people called me ugly. So by the time I was 15 and I found a boyfriend, I was like, oh my God, someone likes me. So immediately I already had low self-esteem, right? And now I put so much value into him having chosen me. And so for about 3.5 years, 4 years, it was exactly like everything we've just been talking about. Every single stage, to the point where if I'd have the courage to break up, right, because I'd finally had enough. Finally, it's gaslighting me. I did say that. You're an asshole, right? Like at 16, 17, we just scream at each other. Zero communication skills. And the thing he would say to me is, all right, go and leave me. You're never going to find someone that loves me as much as I love you. Now, when you've spent a couple of years with this person, it's the only person that's ever shown you what you think is shown you, right? Love, attention, admiration. I was petrified, and I started to believe him. And I was like, oh my God, well, what if I don't? And that, you can imagine what tied that between love and abuse looked like in my head at the time.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until almost like I went to college, and a lot of boys started hitting on me at college. And so that was almost the thing where I was like, well, maybe he's not the only fish in the sea. Like, 'cause he had really manipulated me to believe I couldn't get another guy.
Yeah, into submission. He manipulated you into losing an idea that you held about yourself, which is that you could have been loved by others, right? Or that you were a lovable person. And so, the weaponizing of our vulnerabilities is something that happens in these toxic cycles, which is why it's, incredibly critical for us to be so attuned to them. Because when we enter these amorous relationships or any relationships and we express our vulnerabilities, I believe it's important for us to express our vulnerabilities in places that we have already analyzed and seen as safe. That we can see the person, I mean, at 15, like, Not a lot of us really can,
I know.
but we can train teenagers to have relationships that are centered on, healthy strategies rather than, manipulative strategies. But for many of us, especially in our generations, like we just didn't have those tools. Like no one was talking about this stuff at all, right? And so we were just entangled in these cycles and in these relationships and almost married into a relationship, right? Where there's like a lot of these just awful experiences that can really spiral you into a place where you no longer really kind of like know how to navigate out of it. But again, like whenever we have the knowledge and we have hopefully the willpower to extract ourselves from the relationship, then we have an opportunity to create abundance in our relationships thereafter and hopefully not get sucked back into the cycle.
Yeah, I still think about what would have happened if I didn't leave him. Like, what would have happened? Because started dating him at 15, but we were so on and off. It was like one of these very turbulent relationships. He was verbally abusive. He pushed me a few times, so he was definitely physical as well. And he just wasn't a nice guy. So, but it was on and off up until the age of like 19, 20. So I think about what would have happened to my life if I had stayed there. What would have happened to my confidence? Who would I have been? And thank the Lord that just enough things stacked that I had the confidence and courage to just finally leave him. And it was interesting, and I believe they say this about narcissists, but and I'm not sure if he was a narcissist or not. I don't like to just fling that word around, but he was definitely abusive. And when I finally had the confidence to be like, nah, I'm done. It wasn't like, oh my God. I was just like, no, I'm done. He kept trying to come back into my life.
Yeah.
And what is that? Is that breadcrumbing? I think they call
Yeah,
it these
yeah,
days.
it
The
is.
youngsters these days call
And
it.
hoovering like the vacuum, right? Like to suck you back in. And I'm so sorry that you went through that and that I did, right? Like I think a lot of these experiences, they're probably a bit more common than we give credit. And usually, what tends to happen in a toxic cycle is that that person is now losing their own supply. So we are actually supplying the need that they have to have power and domination over a person. And so when they've actually lost that, the remaining tactic is to hoover you back in and to send you those, but I love you texts or whatever other text that they know is going to give them an in. And then eventually they'll go back into love bombing and then continue the cycle.
Yeah, it's the I'm sorry, I won't do that again, I'll change. And because I think you really do hope that what they say is true, you want to almost give them the benefit of the doubt. But then in that benefit of the doubt, it almost concretizes in their mind that you can be hoovered back.
And remember, like if we are already at a point of an emotional addiction, then it means that we're going to be looking for that which they're already giving us in that Hoover stage. I'm sorry, I love you, I'll change, I'm here, what can I do? All the things that we desired, right? So the dopamine effect, the oxytocin, and all those beautiful hormones are like fluttering around, and it's going to be all the more easy to actually get hoovered back in.
And I think in everything that you just said, it's really powerful for anyone listening to not blame themselves that they keep getting hoovered back in, right? It's a very manipulative, specific tactic that someone's using when they know your triggers, they know how to pull at your strings, they know exactly how to play you in essence. And but we still go back to beating ourselves up afterwards.
Yeah. And the thing, I'm so glad that you're mentioning that because it's really essential to also not get back into a point of, self-submission because a lot of the stuff is learned, right? And for us to not beat ourselves up whenever we do get into these stages where we believe we would never find ourselves because it is a very powerful, very effective type of strategy to engage someone in a manipulative cycle. It is incredibly effective, which is why it happens so often. So like I said, there are people that can perhaps be, targets that are sought after, but anybody can actually be, in essence, like brought into a cycle of this nature.
Well, I could freaking talk to you forever. This has been fun, I guess, is like a weird word to say about something so heavy.
Yeah.
But like, in all honesty, now with this breakdown, it is so beautifully concrete for people to look at and go, where am I in this cycle? What should I be expecting? And how do I freaking get out of it? So that they don't keep repeating this cycle, the 7 stages over and over for years and years, decades and decades, and then God forbid end up, you know, in their older lives where they look back as like all those years that I've wasted, where I could have been treating myself better and being with someone that actually deserves me.
And like, you know, there is an opportunity each and every day to decide to break the cycle and to then create the life that you really deserve, that we all deserve. We deserve a life that we love and that is in abundance. And there's opportunity each and every day.
Dude, I freaking adore you.
Me too.
Where can
I
people
love you
find
too.
you and all the amazing content you're putting out and your upcoming
Thank you.
book, which we
Thank
didn't
you.
even touch on, Break the Cycle?
Well, in essence, we did, you know, because, you know, I do focus on disrupting cycles of toxic abuse in the book as well in a more expanded way. So it's all in there, but people can find me at drmarielbuque.com or at dr.marielbuque on all of social. And my book, Break the Cycle, A Guide to Healing Intergenerational Trauma, will be out January 2nd, and it's out on pre-order now. So people can find it on my website and on social. And I'm excited for a whole generation of cycle breakers to come out of this book.
Keep watching to learn how to set boundaries, end manipulation, and stop being pushed around.
So where I want to start is something very unique that I've never heard about. You talk about corrupt boundary data. Can you actually just tell us what that is, and then we'll dive a little deeper?
Sure. This is really the misinformation that we got growing up about boundaries. So nobody talks to you about boundaries, you witness them. So all of us have this downloaded boundary blueprint, is what I call it. So this unconscious material that drives our behavior in reference to boundaries. So it matters what country, what culture, your family system, all of those things, the modeled behavior that you saw growing up, all of them come together to create your boundary blueprint. But most people, A, don't know that there's a lot of corrupted data in that blueprint, and B, they don't even know that these downloaded schemas kind of in your mind, your unconscious mind, if you go down into the basement, you could actually take a look at them and decide whether that is for you or not for you. But usually we just go, oh, I guess this is the way the world is. So hopefully what Boundary Boss is doing is giving people a step-by-step process to find out what is in your basement around boundaries.
I love that. What is in your basement? That's so good. Because going to the beginning of just assessing our assumptions, because I think that that's something that we just almost take for granted. How do we start to assess what type of mindset and limiting beliefs we actually have in order to then say, oh, I can then change this, or this is a choice?
Most people will ask me, I don't even know about my boundaries. I don't know if they're good. I don't know if they're bad. I don't know if they're too strict. I don't know if they're too loose. So part of it is you have to think about where are you resentful, right? I have people do a resentment inventory because this will usually reveal where a boundary is needed or one that you've set is being violated or a need of yours is not being met. And instead of just being like, I'm angry, we really are drilling down into who are you holding resentment for? Because that usually can tell you where you need a boundary. And in reference to figuring out your boundary sort of archetype or your style, I actually created a free quiz that people can take. It's just boundaryquiz.com, where you can go and see where do you fall? Are your boundaries, your disordered boundaries, are they because they're too loose? Or is it because they're too rigid? And this is something that I think that there is a lot of myths around. People are like, oh, you're a boundary boss. You must be saying no all the time and telling people my way or the highway. And I'm like, no, that's not it at all. That is the other side of the spectrum. So in particular, women have a tendency to overgive. I mean, let's be honest about how we were raised. Most of us were raised and praised for being self-abandoning codependents.
Can you break that down a little, like when you say that, what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, self-abandoning means that I choose what I think is better for you than for me. I don't want conflict. I don't want you to be mad at me. I'm afraid to be rejected. So instead of asserting what is true for me, I will abandon myself in that moment. I will suck it up, take one for the team. I could, there's a million things we could say about it, but that is self-abandonment when we prioritize the needs and desires of others over our own, right? So that's the self-abandoning part. But the codependent piece is so incredibly common with women because we're taught to be like, we're the bridgers, right? We're the like producers of like life, right? We're the ones in the middle of all the things. But when you think about what codependency actually is, well, usually it's overgiving, right? It's really a covert or overt bid for control. That is what codependency is, and it doesn't look like that. And I have this very high functioning group of women in my practice. I've always had that demographic. So when I first started seeing this sort of epidemic of codependency and disordered boundaries, and I would say, oh, hey, what you're describing is codependent behavior. And they would be like, what are you, nuts? I am not dependent on squat. Everyone is dependent on me. I'm making all the money. I'm the one doing all the friggin' things and making sure the kids are getting where they need to go. And I'm like, oh, my clients do not know what codependency actually is. And so I created a new name, high functioning codependency, because that is what I was when I was still super actively codependent. So high functioning codependents are the women where everyone is like, you're the rock, right? I always come to you with my problems. And we're doing it all, but at the expense of ourselves. Inherent in codependency are disordered boundaries. So you cannot be codependent and have healthy boundaries because these two things are actually mutually exclusive. But what is codependency? It's you being overly invested in the feeling states, the outcomes, the circumstances, the relationships of the people in your life to the detriment of your internal peace, your financial or physical, spiritual well-being. Because really, Lisa, I mean, all of us are lovers, right? Of course, we are invested in the happiness of the people that we love. That's not codependency. Codependency is when you are overly so. And if you're wondering, anyone watching or listening, like, how can I tell? Well, if your best friend calls you with a problem, I'm going to ask you to check your urgency. Did you suddenly start making phone calls and Googling and going, getting your books and underlining things? Like, do you feel compelled to fix your friend's problem? The moment your best friend called you, did that then become literally your problem? That is codependency, where instead of being compassionate to our friend or having faith that our friend has the answers for herself, we really think it's on us. And really, it's so much of this stems from childhood, a chaotic childhood, addiction, abuse, and really even just a very strict household, religious household. Pretty much any household anyone was raised in could really sow the seeds for codependency.
Oh my God, that was so amazing. Like, that was so amazing because I've heard, codependency, the word thrown around a lot. And so you just breaking that down was so beautiful. And I'd never heard it explained like that before. How do we start to then pass between the wonderful feeling of feeling needed? And now we're spilling into codependency where you have a dysfunctional relationship and you are not setting boundaries.
Well, the awareness is the first step. Because what shifted it for me in my 20s, I had a brilliant therapist who helped me see that what I was doing, one of my sisters had a really like rough life. So she was with an abusive guy. There was all these things where I for sure thought it was my problem to fix. And I was talking about it in therapy and crying and what am I going to do? Right. My therapist is like, excuse me. So she went on to say, Terry, let me ask you something. What makes you think that you know what lessons she needs to learn in this lifetime? And I was like, well, I think we can all agree it doesn't have to be with this abusive idiot. Like, why? I mean, it doesn't have to be like this. And she was like, I actually can agree with that because I have no idea what your sister needs to learn in this lifetime. And neither do you. Do you know what's really going on for you? And I was like, no, obviously. And I said, clue me in, and she said, you have worked really hard to create internal peace for yourself. And your sister's dumpster fire of a life is really messing with that peace. So what you really want is to tie that up in a bow so you can be internally peaceful, which you can't because you're so codependent with your sister. What's happening to her feels like it's happening to you, but it's not. And I was like, oh my God. And when I really thought about it, because prior to that, I was like, me, I'm just a lover. I really like to think of myself as Mother Teresa. Right? Like it's all from this loving place. That there was so much clarity in that moment that it was really a bid for control because her messed up life was messing up my peace. And she said, now, from that perspective, now how do we problem solve? And I was like, I step back until she wants help or we'll get away from this idiot and that'll help her. She's like, correct. I step back. I tell my sister, hey, I love you, but I can't listen to you telling me the same horrendous crap every day about this guy. But if you ever want to make a change, I'm still your person. And about 9 months later, she called me and she's like, hello, I'm ready. I was like, great, I'm getting in my car. And that was that. And she went back to school and got sober. And all of the things that came from that were not because of me, because I centered myself in my sister's problem. They were because my sister was ready to change and to grow and to commit to a different life. And when you think about how narcissistic it really is or self-important to be like, but I really know what you should do. Of course, that wasn't how I meant it. I didn't think I had a choice. I thought I had to do it because she was my sister. But this is what codependency looks like and the truth about what we're doing. That bid for control really is hard. So what can you do instead, right? That was the longest way around the barn to get back to your question, which is, what can we do instead? Part of it is your awareness, right? I build all of my work on these 5 pillars of self-mastery or transformation that I created. And the first is self-awareness. So you cannot shift anything that you were unaware of, right? That's obvious. And then we move into self-knowledge. Like, why am I this way? And then there's self-acceptance, self-compassion, and then self-mastery. But this beginning phase of awareness is really important. So what does that require? It requires you to become radically curious without judgment. Deepak would say, become the observer without judgment. And this is like the highest sort of your own evolution, that you get curious and go, well, my friend called me with a problem. Did I immediately jump into action, or was I able to stop and say to my friend, hey, before I weigh in, if you want my opinion, because if they're used to coming to you, they do want your opinion, but you don't need to give it. What do you think? What does your gut say? Listen, you know better than anyone what's right for you. So I'm here to brainstorm it, but what is your gut? Like, there's a way that we can trust that the people in our life are responsible for themselves, whether they know what to do or not. But it's not people that we love, right? It's like we're managing people instead of relating to them in this love way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's so beautiful way of framing it. I'd actually love to, I'm so specific. It's like, okay, what did you say? So with your sister, for instance, everything you just said is beautiful. And asking someone, what does your gut tell you? What are you feeling? I totally understand that. Now I'm envisioning in a scenario, which I think we all know these people, where it's the same problem that repeats and they don't want to look at themselves. And like you were saying with your sister, where you came to this conclusion of, oh, I'm, codependent. It's not good for either of us. How did you overcome the guilt? Because I think that's so huge when it comes to boundaries, that we feel guilty, that maybe we're abandoning them. Like in those moments, if you have your sister who you love to bits and who maybe is very emotional, and when you say, I can't deal with this anymore, or did you go through any guilt? Did you go through any worry of abandonment? Did she approach you with abandonment? Because then what do we say in those situations where we can have the strength to stick by the boundary that we're trying to lay out?
Well, all good questions. And of course, I had guilt because I had been such an overfunctioner. So to
Right.
actually draw that boundary, that very difficult emotional boundary, was incredibly hard. But she knew why I was doing it. And when, I just said, listen, I love you. And you staying in this abusive situation is too painful for me. I can't continue because it is disrupting my life so much. So if you want to change, I'm here. I love you, but I can't be a part of this because it is so dysfunctional and painful. And she's like, I love you too. And I understand. Now she understood. And part of her, I think, was relieved in a way that I was going to back off. And then, she was in it for 9 months before she came out of it. And of course, I was worried, hey, maybe she's never coming out of it. I don't know.
Right.
But it wasn't just that it was my right to not do it. It is wrong emotionally to think that we have the answers for others. Think about it this way. When I was doing all of these quick fixes for my sister, giving money, going to help, finding a place for her to live, whatever, all of those things, what I was doing is I was lessening the pain that would inspire her to change. You were saying you have a friend who calls and talks about the same crap, but never ever changes and doesn't want to look at herself, just wants to keep talking. That's the same thing, because you get off the phone with that friend and that friend feels lighter. She's like, wow, Lisa, I always feel so much better after talking to you. You get off the phone and you feel like someone barfed toxic waste on you because they did. So you're absorbing that energy. They feel better. So now the pain, the suffering that would inspire them to find their own solution, we are literally lessening that likelihood of them doing that if we continue to be a Band-Aid on this gaping wound that needs more than a Band-Aid, right? But it buys more time. And as soon as I knew that me doing that was really colluding with her lowest self, I was like, oh yeah, I'm done. Like, I'm not colluding with the addicted part of her anymore. I have faith. She can get it together. I really think that she can get sober if she wants to, but not if I'm here, doing all the things so she doesn't feel the pain of her choices. Right? These are choices. And I don't think addiction is a choice. I mean, I'm recovering myself. So it's no blame in that, but choices, right? You're choosing to stay.
Wow, that's so strong. And where's the fine line between then obligation and a choice? Because I think a lot of us do feel the obligation, and we don't realize it's a choice to then switch that.
Well, part of it is question your downloaded blueprint. Question why you feel obligated. Is it because your mother made you feel obligated because you were the oldest kid and you take care of your family as everything, and if you don't do this, then you're wrong? I mean, you come from a very strong culture where family is all the things. Being Greek, it's like every country, culture, and family system itself has all of these cultural norms of the right way to be. You were indoctrinated into these beliefs, and maybe some of them stay, and maybe a lot of them don't. And you have a choice to, and you yourself, you're a good example because you are an outside the box thinker. So people are like, you don't want to having kids, and you're like, because I don't fucking want to. Like, you're able to own, like, hey, I'm not less than because of that. But if you didn't have such a strong sense of self or hadn't done the work that you've done, that might make you feel ashamed. That might make you feel bad. Or you might have kids even though you don't want to. Like, that's how strong and how deep those that what do we call it, corrupted data runs. In order to be lovable, you must behave this particular way, which is just simply not true.
Yeah, I definitely was told that growing up, that I would end up a wife and kid, having kids, and I never really questioned it. And so that where like the obligation, I think, came in, where it's like, of course I'm going to do it. Like, you know, my parents have been telling me my whole life, until I decided that I didn't want any. And I had to question that. I had to set boundaries with my family, because it's, no matter how many times, and I'm sure many people can relate, no matter how many times you may actually even say something out loud, it took me time to get the courage to say it and then say it out loud. And even when I did, I still got people asking me. Even when I said I've decided to not have children, I would get my family and my dad and my mom saying, you know, oh, but, you know, life isn't, you know, worth living if you don't have children. And so I ended up having to set that boundary, say, can you please stop trying to persuade me? Because it's taking away almost the power of me saying I am not going to have it, because it is insinuating you can now persuade me to change my mind.
Right. But this is a boundary issue. So this is really, it's an emotional and or a mental boundary issue. So you made a decision, you know how you feel, you know what you think, and you've been super clear about your boundary. And then you have, we call them repeat offenders, who just keep on coming back to trample on that boundary one more time. It's like the person who you say, absolutely not, I don't want to do the thing. I'm not doing the thing. I had a client who had this experience. And literally, as she's leaving this party or wherever she was, that she had to like emphatically say no many times to this person. They were like, okay, so why don't you just take tonight? Why don't you sleep on it and we'll talk tomorrow? She's like, oh my God, what part of no do you not understand? And that is a boundary violation, because someone is attempting to wear down your no. That's a boundary violation. Change your mind after you've said, please don't, a boundary violation there too. When you think about what we learned, right? As little girls, what was it? Be good, right? Be a good girl, smile, turn that frown around, right? Don't be a troublemaker. Don't stir the pot. And it's all about giving to others also, where if you're a good girl, or if you grow up to be a good woman, you know, what is embodies femininity is all about self-sacrifice, which who wants that? You know, that's not what it's all about, but yet it is what we learned. And so when you think about boundaries, think about them as a language. And you wouldn't feel bad if you weren't fluent in like Mandarin, just because you really wanted to be, right? You would know, oh, if I want to be fluent in Mandarin, here are things I need to do, steps I need to take, people, I need a guide. I literally need a step-by-step process. And you wouldn't expect to be fluent after doing that for like 2 hours. You would know it takes time. This is the same thing, where we always start small with everything when it comes to boundaries, is that we never tackle like the boundary bullies or the boundary destroyers in our life. It's like the low priority people, where we just, if you're someone who they get your order wrong when you go out, and you normally would say, that's fine, I'll eat it, I don't care, it doesn't matter. Just send the friggin' salad back and get the salad that you want, right? Just send it back, because it's about you. When you think about what are boundaries, these are like your own personal rules of engagement. And we share them with other people because it tells them what's okay with us and what's not okay with us. And that means you must know your preferences, your desires, your limits, and your deal breakers, because those are the things that not only make up your boundaries, they also make up who you are. Your preferences, desires, limits, deal breakers, Lisa, they're unique to you. Mine are unique to me. We are all so different. It's just like our fingerprints, right? Or our DNA. It's very similar. Most people don't know their own preferences, desires, limits, and deal breakers. People who identify as women in particular don't know, because we're so busy. I can tell you what everyone else's preferences are. Every person in my life, I know what they eat, what they're allergic to, what they do and don't like, all the things. You know, when I would have women come into my therapy practice, and I would say, okay, like in the beginning, like, so what brings you joy? That would just be one of the questions. And I would say, honestly, 9 times out of 10, they would say, I don't know. I gotta be honest, I never really thought about it. I'm like, okay, well, now it's time to think about it. Maybe we can think about it now. because they're so busy becoming an expert on all the people in their life. But all of that overgiving, overfunctioning, overdoing, that abandonment of self, that can only lead to one place, which I hate to say it's like a one-way ticket to bitter land, but it is. Because you will only be angry eventually. You can do it for a long time, and then you're pissed. And think about all these moms. Like I have friends who are like, oh, my mom is such a martyr, blah, blah, blah. Well, you don't think that that mom, when she was 20, was like, I can't wait to grow up and be a martyr. I mean, right?
So true.
She didn't think that was going to happen.
Yeah.
But it does. Because if you are self-sacrificing, because it's a way to keep people attached to you, because that's what codependency really is, that is driven by fear, not actually driven by love. So if you're kind of bean counting the stuff that you do for everyone, if you feel that people are not appreciative enough of all of your efforts, you want to question, like, am I giving because I'm afraid if I don't, I'll be rejected, I'll be judged, I'll be kicked out of the pack? Like, what is the fear? Because if you're giving from love, you're not bean counting, right? You're giving because you want to, not because you're like, I'm keeping score and now you owe me. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, I've got an amazing quote of yours. Giving is love, overgiving is dysfunctional.
Yeah, it is. And I think that, Lise, part of this thing about self-love, because self-love is such an important part of what I write about in the book. Like, it's less of a feeling, let's say, and it's more of a way of life that is evidenced in your relationships, your boundaries, your self-care, right? How well you negotiate for your own needs. That is what self-love is, because it's action. It isn't a feeling. It's like, how are you relating to yourself? Because if you put everyone above yourself, if you are last on your own list, if you have a terribly negative inner voice that's so mean and caustic to you, then you are literally setting the bar in your life. You will inevitably attract others who agree with that low self-assessment. And when you feel good about yourself, live self-love, you are setting the bar higher, and you will inevitably attract folks who think that that is how worthy you are. But it all rises or falls based on how you feel about yourself. And so I would have clients who were like looking for love in all the wrong places, because they were looking for self-love in love with others. And I'm like, they're not the same. And this place that we have, every single one of us has this inside of us, this place that only self-love can fill. No amount of overworking, no amount of love from others can fill this particular spot within us. So it really is a worthy cause to fall madly and deeply in love with yourself and question these limiting beliefs about, oh, don't get a big head. And if you fall madly and deeply in love with yourself, then you're conceited or you're selfish. That really isn't true. But if you are not rocking this kind of self-love where you're taking care of yourself first, you really don't have that much to give to others, because what we're seeking from others, they cannot provide, because it is an inside job,
It's so beautiful, because I think you even said something along the lines of, we think of boundaries as saying no and pushing people away, but actually it's about keeping our inner peace inside of us. And that was such a beautiful way of flipping the perspective of boundaries, because I do think that, going back to the guilt thing that we were talking about, if we can see it as, this is good for you, and this isn't about being mean or pushing people away, but this is for your future, your sanity, your happiness. Like, I just think that allows us to take a step forward if we don't necessarily feel like we have the confidence yet to set that boundary.
I think you're right. And flipping the meaning, or flipping the view on that, it is the most loving thing that you can ever do. Because what is it to establish healthy boundaries in your relationships? It's really about allowing the people in your life to authentically know who you are. When you're saying yes, when you really want to say no, that isn't being nice. That's just being dishonest. So how can anyone ever authentically love you if you never allow them to authentically know you?
I've never thought of it like that. Oh my God, that's so amazing. That's so true. Again, going back to perspective, I'm always trying to think about what are the reasons why people don't set boundaries in the first place, and what is the thing that holds us back. And everything you're saying in just flipping the way that we think about it, to me, really does allow then the space to want to do it with grace, versus like for me, when I was first setting boundaries, I was like, all right, you got to have the strength, you got to go in like a bull, you got to have to draw the hard line, right? Yep. And it's like, because I didn't have enough confidence to set it and keep it. So I thought if I go in with aggression, maybe I can't be bullied out of it.
Yep.
Obviously it was terrible strategy, but it was the first thing that I needed in order to just get started. And so everything that you've just said allows, I think, people to really get started with without the aggression that I came in and had originally.
It's normal though, like what you're saying, right? We go from the pendulum always swings like that. They were too porous, that's what we call them, boundaries that are too loose. And then you swing over here and it's too rigid. But through time and repetition, you realize that there is a healthy place in between. And I think that for people watching or listening, if you're like, but I don't even know where to start, you do though. So why don't we just start with stopping the auto yes? Why don't we just start with that? If you're someone who's a people pleaser, and this won't speak to everyone, but it will most likely speak to quite a big majority of people listening. If you're a people pleaser, or if you sort of just are an insta yes person, when someone's like, can you do this? Or would you do this? We're going to stop doing that because we need to stop doing that. So moving into what do you do instead? Right? And you can buy time. You can literally buy time. That is what you're going to do instead. So you're just going to say, oh, hey, I just need to get back to you in this period of time or that period of time. I need to check with my partner, my roommate, whoever it is. That is what you're doing. Because if you can stop the immediate, yes, it is so much easier to come back and say no, if that's what the answer is. So when we give the immediate yes to crap we really want to say no to, then what happens? Oh, then we find a way to get out of it. We get a migraine. Oh, I'm sorry, I just got a migraine because I can't come, right? Like we end up being the person that people really can't count on because we can't deal with telling the truth. And you know what? If you say yes when you really want to say no, no offense, but you're actually not really emotionally trustworthy. You're not a trustworthy person. Because I know my friends who are people pleasers. I love them. And when they say, I'm definitely going to be there, I think in my mind, there's a 50% chance she's going to do that. And the people I feel safest with are the people who, when they say they're going to do something, I'm like, oh yeah, she doesn't say yes unless she's really in. I don't have to double check. There's not going back and forth. It's just, no. I have a great story in the book about a close friend of mine, Elizabeth, and I got in touch with her. I was like, hey, do you want to go to Honduras or wherever I was going for something? And she's like, oh no, I hate it. I hate hot weather. I hate the sand. I hate sun. Nah, but thanks. I hope you have a great time. Like, she wasn't even like, oh, I wonder if she's going to be upset. Like, she was just like, no, I don't like it. Great. It didn't make me think she doesn't like me, right? She doesn't like hot weather. That's her right. And she's someone I can trust because she's not a bullshitter.
So you actually mentioned the types of boundaries. I'd love to go through the categories and the types, because I think that would be super useful for people to, once you said identify and now start to pass out what type of boundary they then need to put into place.
Right. So we have categories. So there's categories of boundaries and then sort of styles of boundaries. So the categories are, we start with physical boundaries, which is all about your physicality, who can touch you, how much personal space you need. So think about a close talker. When you have someone who's like, you step back and they step forward and you're like, hey man, you eventually will say something, but some people don't mind a close talker, right? So it's all very unique to you. So underneath the physical boundaries is also sexual boundaries, which is what is okay for you sexually? Do you have unsafe sex? If you don't, then that's a boundary that you need to put in place. And a boundary violation there is someone touching you in any way without your permission, massaging your shoulders, even if someone thinks you should be flattered by the attention. It's for you to decide whether that's okay or not. And then we have material boundaries, and that's how you relate to your things. So you may, lend your car to people, you may not. You may lend money to people, you may not. You may like your car to be very clean, and if your cousin comes in your car and leaves a bunch of crap around, that is a material boundary violation. And there's nothing wrong with you wanting your car to be clean, right? And it's okay to say to your cousin, hey man, when you leave, take your shit with you. Like, you messed up my clean car. I don't like that. You know how I feel about my car. So this
and
is
so
where,
many of us, in those situations, just bite our tongue and like, okay, make the mess. Like, you dread it, it's about to happen. You bite your tongue when it's happening. They leave, and then you like swear under your breath as you're cleaning it up.
Yep, exactly. What we do is we just put it in that file cabinet, right? The file cabinet of resentment. Just another reason why cousin Bob is an asshole. There you go. Just putting it in the file cabinet, and maybe one day I'll use it. But we don't forget those violations. And when you can just say it, it's so liberating, because you're not accumulating so much resentment, right? Because when you can't say it, you are accumulating resentment. Then we have emotional boundaries, which is knowing how you feel, and knowing that how other people feel is their responsibility. So when you have healthy emotional boundaries, you're not easily guilted by others. You also don't blame others for your life, your choices, and what you've done.
Yeah, can you give us an example there? Because I think we do that without realizing.
Well, I think that anything that we're upset about, like we will say, this person like made me feel a particular way. And the truth is, people don't really make us feel. We feel what we feel based on such an array of different factors. Now, it doesn't mean maybe they did use a harsh tone with you, but instead of blaming, it's more about stepping forward and saying, hey, I'd like to make a simple request that you back up with that tone. I feel like it's really aggressive, and it's really hard for me to hear what you're saying when you're talking in that way. So if you want to take a time out, I'm happy to do that. But we say something instead of being like, how I feel is that person's responsibility. We tell them, we negotiate for our needs, which is to not allow someone to talk to us in a tone that makes us feel degraded, or whatever that scenario might have been, right? So that is emotional boundaries. And then you have mental boundaries, which is what you think and your opinion on things. And if you have healthy emotional boundaries, you can hold on to what you think, even if you're with others who don't think like you, who think different than you. You also don't take it super personally if they don't think like you. So those are the categories. And then, as I said before, then we look at, how does the dysfunction show up? Is it porous boundaries, which means that they're too loose? So in the boundary archetype stuff, that's more like a peacekeeper or a pushover or a chameleon, right? Someone who suddenly sort of just takes on the thoughts and feelings of the people they're around. So that's too loose. The healthy boundaries, of course, are right in the middle. And then over here are boundaries that are too rigid, where it's like, in some ways, an overreaction. It is the person who's like, hey man, my way or the highway. That is a disordered boundary because it's too rigid, right? You can't work with other people if that is what you say. If you have rigid boundaries, you're way more likely to cut someone out of your life than you are to tell them what they did that hurt your feelings. You're just like, I'm done with you, bye. Because you don't have the capacity, really, probably emotionally, to work it out. But it's this very, it's a reactive way of being. So there we go. Those are the categories, and then those are the types.
That's amazing. I literally was about to ask you, what's the difference between a rigid boundary and a non-negotiable boundary?
That's a perfect question. So let's look at what is the difference. If you are throwing down a rigid boundary, you are not really having a conversation. You have decided that this person did something you don't like, and you're like, it's like, here's the extreme of what it is. If a non-negotiable means that there's something that you cannot abide by in your life, that it is a deal breaker, right? It threatens the relationship you're in. When I was dating, before I've been with my husband 25 years, but when I was dating back in the day, when I was a talent agent, one of my friends was setting me up with people. And I said, this is way long before there was like Tinder or any of that. And
Yeah.
I said, hey,
I remember the days, girl, don't worry.
that's what I'm talking about. I said, hey, and I also don't want to date anyone in recovery. Now, not because I'm judgy, because I was in recovery and I was like, hey, one addict in a relationship is enough for me. That's my choice. And she was all like, I don't understand. That's so judgmental. Why would you do that? I was like, hey, man, you don't have to understand. See, that's my deal breaker. That's my choice. And you don't have to understand. And this is true about your boundaries too. So people may say, you shouldn't feel that way. That is an emotional boundary violation, right? That is someone trampling on your boundaries. So you have every right to have deal breakers. And then we have an obligation to share what they are. Because if we keep our deal breakers to ourselves and our relationships, then how is the other person going to know what the problem is or what we're talking about? But we also need to tell the other person, what is non-negotiable. And sometimes that means relationships end, right? Sometimes that's what that means. But at least you're not abandoning yourself in that process, because in relationships where we are readily abandoning ourselves, we will eventually either leave the relationship or just be miserable.
Yeah. God, that's so true. Because when I first met my husband, I just told him my non-negotiables, and I told him, like, I wasn't great at setting boundaries. It wasn't like I had this confidence. It was more, oh, if I don't tell him and he does it, like, because it's non-negotiable for me, my relationship's over. So set the relationship up for success and lay out the things that are important to you. And so for me, it was, if he ever cheated on me, I would literally be out the door. He wouldn't even have time to explain to me what happened. I would pack my bags and I would be out. And the same if he ever laid a finger on me abusively. There would just be no explanation. Those are my two. And I just laid them out from the beginning in order for us to both know how we can make this relationship succeed. But sometimes it really is hard to set to the non-negotiables, especially if it's like family members. Like when it's a partner, you're going to break up with them. But it's a whole different world if you set non-negotiables for parents. And I have a lot of my audience ask me a lot about how to set those boundaries with parents when, in fact, let's answer that first. And then what if someone then becomes a regular offender of that?
Well, there has to be a consequence if someone is a regular offender, right? So in the book, I teach you about a proactive boundary success plan. So these are steps that we take before we have a boundary conversation, especially if we're talking about our parents or siblings or, people who you've had long relationships with. So you know them. If your father is super crabby before he has his coffee in the morning, then you're probably not going to have this conversation at 7 a.m. Like, you want to set yourself up to be successful. And then you come up with what are going to be the words that you're going to say. And in the book, I give you probably, I don't even know, 1 million boundary scripts for every scenario, from like leaving a cult to, literally, I hit them all. So you can look in there, you can definitely find something you can use. And a lot of it are just sentence starters, because that's what we need. We need, like, how do I approach it? You can start with gratitude, right? You can start by saying, you know how much I love you. And that's why I need to make a simple request that you, when you want to come over to my house, even though we're close, that you text me and ask me if it's convenient. Because when you use the key, A, it startles me, but B, Dad, you don't know, I could be running around naked. So can we agree that if you're going to come over during the day, you will A, ask me if it works, and B, not use your key. Now, so what do you do if, and this is a real situation with one of my clients, that she moved close to home, and the parents, even though she said, please stop coming over without warning, they were like, oh, come on, it's fine, it's just us. They kept doing it. And then she told them, hey, if you keep doing this, I will change the locks. And they were like, oh, that's ridiculous, she's not going to change the locks. She changed the locks. And they were not, they weren't mad because she had warned them and they had been violating her boundary. But from that point forward, she said, you guys, you could have just respected what I asked of you. And instead I had to, spend $400 to change all my locks. And now I really need for you to do this. And they actually did. But sometimes it takes a consequence, right? That consequence was them not, jamming it in and having it not work and being like, wow, she's really serious about this. And she was. So I think that it depends on what boundary violations are happening. It depends on if the family system is toxic or not. These are two really important parts, because if you're talking about having a narcissistic mother, or anything that I've talked about the normal and healthy way of setting boundaries does not apply. If you're talking about.
So what would you do in that situation then if you do have a narcissistic parent?
Oh, step back.
Yeah.
Step back. There are a lot of psychotherapists who will say, you can change that relationship, but I've seen the damage that allowing a narcissist to be close to you, especially when you're a woman and it's your mother, oh my God, it is just devastating. So it depends. Do they have narcissistic tendencies, or are they a full-blown toxic narcissist? And again, those are two extremes, because if someone just has narcissistic tendencies and they're not really diagnosable, they could change. But you have to say, hey, whatever, I'd like to make a simple request. That's one way of putting it. Or I wanted to bring it, get it on your radar. I wanted to talk to you about what happened last Wednesday, how I wanted to let you know how I felt. And again, when we are communicating, we're always sticking to our side of the street. We are so clear that we are not using you, we are not pointing fingers, we are not making sweeping generalizations. When you talk about yourself, this was my experience. Who can say, no, it wasn't? I mean, somebody might try, but generally speaking, when someone says, hey, this is what happened for me, I'm not saying that was your intention, but I want you to know that you being late really made me feel unimportant. So I just want you to know that, because I love you and I don't want it to keep happening. Right? We're telling people how we feel, so we're not adding stuff to that file cabinet.
God, I love that so much. And giving people words to start the conversation, is so powerful to me, because I can't get out of my own way of how my thoughts are spinning in my head. I just can't. And so I go, okay, I'm not going to let that stop me. So what are the things I can do? What tools can I use in order to still set the boundaries? Because I know long-term it's good for me. And so having things like that, the phrases that allow me to start the conversation, is so powerful. One of the things that I started to do was saying to people that I love, I'm really struggling with, and this is how you can help. Because again, I used to come in that you're doing this wrong. And like anything, it's just when you're telling someone that they're doing something wrong, what are they going to do? Immediately defend themselves. Right. And so I had to change the strategy and find words that would help. And so that thing that you just said was so beautiful in giving people that opening sentence to be able to, start the discussion.
And another thing, Lisa, is that we never want to say to someone, we need to talk, because you know what? Nobody ever wants to talk to you. When you are, I just scared myself. If anyone says we need to talk, you're like, oh my God, no way. So
and you come in with those defenses already up, correct?
Of course, you've warned them, you've told them to put their defenses up. So we love to do it in a neutral way. Part of the proactive boundary success plan is visualizing it going well. Mm-hmm. And when I say going well, I don't mean controlling what they do. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about you being the baller that you are, having the courage to negotiate for what you want and telling the truth, because that is where your healing is. Your healing is insane. What I think matters. How I feel matters because I matter. And if other people go, oh, I don't like your new boundaries, or I don't like what you're doing, we learn a lot about people when we start to put boundaries in place. And you will find that some people are very flexible and appreciative for the intel about you. And then some people are all offended. And you will have data to make some decisions in your life. But nothing can be more important than your relationship with yourself. And that healing by standing up is just so profound.
I love it. And you actually said a little earlier about staying in your lane. Can you talk to me more about that? Because I believe you give a story in the book where it's like us overstepping other people's boundaries, because that's also important, right? If we want people to respect our boundaries and really embrace them, we need to be giving the gift that we want. And so you talk about staying in our lane. Can you talk to me a bit about that?
I'm laughing a little bit because it is so classic that all the overgivers, right? And when I was an overgiver, anyone who had boundaries and wasn't doing what I was doing, just like laying themselves out for anyone, I would be like, oh, she is so entitled. She is such a bitch. Like, I cannot believe she said no after everything I've done for her. I mean, that she didn't ask me to do, but I'm still holding it against her. So it's a great point that you bring up of how do we keep our side of the street clean, which means we don't just learn how to say no. We learn how to accept someone else's no and talk about that and try to have healthy emotional boundaries and not take it all so personally if they don't do what we want them to do. So, and this is also a process. And you can say, hey, I'm struggling. As you said, I'm struggling right now with that, but I respect your right to choose. Mm. And if we want others to respect our right to our boundaries, we have to also, you give as good as you get. We have to also be able to do that for others. And I feel like, especially as you're moving away from codependency, it is really hard because codependents are, we're like giving advice, auto advice giving all around town. And then we're like mad when someone doesn't take the advice that they didn't even ask us for. We're like, well, if Betty had just done what I said to do, she wouldn't be in this mess. Like, just tend your own life, codependent. So we learn to move away from that, but being able to accept and not center all of these things on ourselves is very humbling.
Yeah. And especially when it's someone that we love, we're always trying to fix them. But sometimes in that fixing, it makes them feel badly about themselves.
Of course it does. I remember a situation with my husband years ago where his rep at the time embezzled money from, it was like a whole thing. And I was ridiculously over the top. I was calling lawyers. I was going to get an entertainment lawyer. I was so mad. And I could see that the more hysterical I became about revenge and getting it from her and whatever I was doing, he was becoming more and more almost like distraught. And then I finally said to him, hey, babe, how can I best support you right now? Because I really got like what I was doing was not it. And he said, you can trust that I will handle this. And I probably won't handle it how you fiery, airy, how you would handle it, right? But trust that I'm going to get it done the way I need to get it done. And I was like, you got it. I stepped off that situation and he handled the entire thing. But that's a perfect example of you saying, we're making the other people feel incompetent by being like, I have a better idea. You should do it this way. That isn't how I would do it. Well, who the frig asked you? It's not your life. Stay on your own side of the street and support the people that you love in finding their own answers, because that really is love. And it doesn't mean if your friend says, hey, I really would like your opinion. It doesn't mean we never give our friends our opinion or our partners, but that's specific language. Vic, my husband, will say to me now, okay, so are you venting or are we brainstorming? Like what would, how can I best support you right now? And I'll be like, I'm just venting. He's like, okay, good to know, go. Like, so he knows he's not going to be saying anything because I'm venting. And those nuances of preferences, because that's what they are, that we share with the people we love deepens our intimacy in such a profound way.
I love that. I do that with my husband too, because I would go into, I just need to be heard, and he would go into, I need to fix it for you. And so we would just end up butting heads. And it's like, hang on a minute, we both are trying to, he's trying to be sweet and kind, but I'm not perceiving it like that because it's not the communication that I'm looking for right now in this moment.
Yep.
I've heard you say, which is so fascinating, about indecisions. And I never thought of it like this, but I actually have a great quote of yours. Crippling indecision keeps us stuck in terrible situations long past the expiration date. Mm. Can you explain that? Because I never even thought twice about indecisions.
Well, indecision, I've seen this in my therapy practice over and over and over. When someone comes in and says, I just can't decide what to do in my relationship. I'm so torn. I'm like, you're not torn. You don't want to know what you already know because you don't think you have the skills to extricate yourself. It's so scary that it's almost like your mind will play a trick on you and be like, well, here's the pros and here's the cons. Another thing about staying in indecision is that it's a way to not make decisions. So you don't have to deal with the fallout of making decisions, right? Because you're staying in the in-between, the holding pattern of not yes, not no. But there's something about that life makes the decisions for you, right? So if you stay in a decision and you don't decide, you are deciding. So that person who would say to me, I'm torn about the relationship, in her not making the decision to leave, that tornness was basically a decision to stay. So I always say, look at the secondary gain, right? Which is the unobvious gain you get by staying stuck. So how do we know what that is? What are you gaining, right? So with that client, I could say, what is she gaining out of being in indecision in her relationship? And the question you ask to decipher that is, what do I get to not face, not feel, or not experience by staying stuck here? So in her case, when she could finally answer the questions, I get to not face the state of my relationship. I get to not feel terrified of having a conversation I don't know how to have, right? I get to avoid that. But then we look at, but what do you lose? What do you lose? Right. And, of course, then we got to what do you lose is you lose the option of finding healthy love that you really want to be in, having a relationship with yourself that isn't all about codependency. So there's a lot of things, but I feel like that secondary gain, that one question is so powerful, no matter where you are stuck in your life. If you can reveal the unobvious gain you're getting unconsciously by staying stuck, it makes it so much easier to get unstuck.
Click here right now to learn the sneaky manipulation tactics that you need to watch out for.
They are distracting you from what your complaint, your issue, maybe there was a violation that they did to you, and now they're using fake concern to basically tell you